First, I have to tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. When I was asked to speak at Bioneers, I was a little nervous. And the reason is because usually I talk about the economy and other people, but I felt like this was the right place to talk about myself. So I'm not usually nervous. I don't usually cry when I speak. But I want to just let you know both will probably manifest today. So just bear with me. But I would be remiss if I started without acknowledging Nikki Henderson. And there's something incredible about watching someone grow to be the person that the world intended them to be, and knowing that their future is far more bright than they can even imagine themselves. And when I look at Nikki, I can't help but see not just what she's done, but how what she will do will continue to impact all of us. And so I want to just thank her, not just for the incredibly kind introduction. There is something very sweet when you work with someone who was a young person who thought you were the devil at some times, who then comes to you and goes, "You might have been right," and then a year later says, "I think you were right," and 2 years later says, "You mothered and held me." So it feels very good to have that moment. I also want to say I just saw her parents who, I love Nikki, but when you see parents who look younger than I do, it becomes very clear that who raises you really matters. I wanted to talk a little bit about being a mama today, and the reason why I wanted to talk about being a mother, that's my baby! The reason I want to talk about being, I could cry now, is because, you know, what's interesting about being a mother is it changes the way you think about change and time. All of my life I've been working for social change, but I really worked for social change during my lifetime. And what being a mom has meant is now I think about social change in her lifetime, not my lifetime. And that's been a really significant thing. And so today is really a love letter to my daughter. And the reason I want to talk about myself is because what you become clear about is that real change is not policy, laws, and government. Real change is how we relate to one another. And to have real change, you have to know who I am, and so I have to learn to talk about who I am. But I will say it's so much easier to talk about what you want than who you are, so bear with me. My name is Phaedra Ellis-Lamkins. I grew up in a small town called Sassoon, which you probably may have heard of because you're actually from California. And I grew up with a mom who was very kind, but a dad who wasn't. And my dad was very violent, and there was a lot of drugs and physical abuse in our house. And what that meant is I carried a lot of shame with me. And I knew that what was happening in our home wasn't happening in everyone else's home, but I knew I wasn't supposed to talk about it. And what I also knew is we didn't have a lot of money. And I knew that was bad. I remember when I was young, I was going into a grocery store and I was paying for pickles with food stamps. And this woman looked at me as though I was crazy, and she started talking about the woman next to her about me and how that's what poor people did is they used those food stamps to buy snacks. And what she didn't understand is I hadn't had a sandwich with meat in it before. We had pickle and cheese sandwiches for lunch because you got free cheese and you got pickles. But what I walked out of that grocery store feeling was that I wasn't okay, that I was less than, and that I knew I had done something bad. And so when you carry with you the very physical feeling of poverty, when you know you have shame and fear, you know something's wrong with you, you sometimes aren't able to talk about what's going on. So I wanted to introduce you to my family, and it looks like you're not seeing them up there, so I'll tell you about them. My mom was a waitress who left my dad. We left in the middle, oh, there she is. We left in the middle of the night, and we moved to Hawaii because that's where she thought we would be safe. And then we came back to the States, technically the Hawaiian States, but we don't always consider it that way in Hawaii. And my mom was a waitress, and she went back to school and got a degree. And the reason I think this photo is important is because as I've become a mother, I start to pay attention to photos. And I start to pay attention to how my daughter thinks and feels. And what I noticed in all of the photos is we don't ever smile in photos because we're carrying something with us. We carry that kind of fear, shame, afraid, and it makes me really sad as a mom because I think that's not what I would want for my own children. So this is us, but we did better. I also want you to see this is my mom now, who's pretty incredible. And the reason I wanted to show her you and also show you my grandmother is because when you also talk about race, people deal very differently with how we communicate about what's going on. And part of what I wanted to talk about and why I wanted to tell you what it was like to grow up poor, black, brown, Jewish, is that I want you to understand why the environmental movement for me was not my people when I interacted with them. And the reason I think it's really important is because the first time I met with the environmental movement, it was in our local community. And in Sassoon, there's Chevron. Within 30 miles, there's Chevron, Anheuser-Busch, C&H Sugar, Sheldon Oil was within 2 houses of where I grew up. And what was interesting is, if you're poor, how do you get to be better? How do you think people think you get to be better? You stop being poor. And it's very simple here in America. And so I was like, and how do you stop being poor if you're poor? You get a job in a place that probably has a pretty bad environment. And so all of the folks that I know that worked in factories that paid middle-class wages worked in places that polluted the environment. And so the first time I met an environmentalist, they were coming into our community and they were saying, basically, you suck. And you work in a place that's killing our kids, and you suck. And the reason it's so important, and I wanted to talk about that, is because I think if you're an environmentalist and you're coming into a community, you might not know what the person is dealing with. And part of why I wanted to talk about myself is because I think if you understand that that person, the only way out of violence, of sexual abuse, of whatever's going on in poverty in their home, is the job that you just said was shitty. And so part of when I first met environmentalists, they came in the community and they said these jobs were really awful, and I hated them. And the reason was they were all rich white people who came in SUVs, who said the environment ought to not be bad, so we should stop going to work so they could have clean parks for their kids. And I was like, yeah, that equation doesn't actually work really good for us. And the reason wasn't just because of jobs, but what was interesting to me is these environmentalists, they never talked about the air for our community. It was like, oh no, it's gonna shift. And so I thought, that just doesn't seem right. So I decided I would hate environmentalists for the rest of my life, and which I did really well for a long time. And I would never join the Sierra Club, and I would join the labor movement and beat the environmental movement. Then I had nieces. And the thing about having nieces when you have a sister that's an addict and their dad is a drug dealer is that you have to start thinking about the world differently. And what I realized is it's actually really messed up that some kids think they only get one choice. And I grew up thinking my only choice was a good job, but all these other kids grew up thinking in these other families that they could have clean air and good jobs. And I thought, we ought to create a way for these kids, for my girls, to get to choose both. But I hope. And here's what I want to just tell you. How many of you, I want everyone to close their eyes. How many of you have ever been abused? How many of you have ever had violence in your home? How many of you carry shame for whatever you think you've done that no one can ever know about? Here's why I think that's really important. Because if we aspire to be a movement for real change, we have to acknowledge the shame we carry. And more than the shame we carry, we have to see it in other people, so when we relate to them and change, we don't diminish who they are. And here's what's different as a mom. One is, I don't know who told people, but everyone thinks they get an opinion of how you mother, which let me just say is messed up. And people offer you advice, and if I don't ask for it, I really don't want it. So please don't tell me what your kid is perfect, does, or how you do it, because I'm living with my own shame, so when you reinforce for me I'm not doing a good job, it's actually not helpful. And as women, I feel like we should stand up and say, I don't actually care what you think, dude. Or, and I have to say to all the amazing fathers, because I have an amazing husband, which I did not know existed, you have a right to say whatever you want, just like mothers do, just not to me. Because I don't ever want to diminish the role of fathers. It's interesting, if you didn't grow up in a community that had a lot of fathers, you don't appreciate how important the role of men is until you have a really compassionate, incredible one in your life, and you go, wow, they make things better in some places. So amazing. I'm just like in shock. Part of why I wanted each one of you to raise your hands is because I think many of us consider ourselves environmentalists. But what I've learned being in the labor movement and working with people of color and coal miners and other things is that we still have a lot to learn as the environmental movement. Is we have to figure out how to hold people for what they've done in a way that honors them so that they get to see the vision that we believe they deserve, which is very different than the vision for ourselves that we want them to implement. Here's what I know. I know that if you work in a coal factory, you know they pollute. I know that if you live like we did next to Sheldon Oil, you know that the stuff in the water isn't good for the water. What you don't know is what's the strategy to get your own self and community out of it that isn't taking away the employment center in the community. And part of why I think it is so incredible that you are all here is because what our prayer at Green for All really is that you will help us figure out how do we create a space where we can authentically know what's going on and who we are and how do we relate to one another. I want to talk to you about one more thing. These are more of the girls. These are my nieces in Hawaii, which is where we love to be. That is not a real tattoo, just important to know. I want you to know. But this is my daughter. And part of why I wanted to be here and I wanted to talk about being a mom is because I want to figure out how we have these conversations. And I wanted to be able to explain that as someone who interacts with the environmental community a lot, it's kind of hard to be a Black woman in the environmental movement. It's kind of hard to walk in a room and everyone actually knows each other from 1970 fighting the Chesapeake Bay. And also that everyone remembers the good old days at Yale. And It's like, and the reason I say that is those of us that went to community colleges and state colleges, we want the same things that other folks do. And sometimes what I learned is through people like Nikki Henderson is I would be in the room and I would think I was being loving and kind and creating space. And she would say, "It doesn't feel that way, just so you know." And I was like, "I'm not hitting, so it should feel loving." So in my world, if you're not hitting, it's loving. So I felt like I had made tremendous growth. But the reason I wanted to be here is because I want you to know the story of the people that you interact with. I want you to know when you see someone like me who walks in a room that I carry with me. I might walk really confidently into a room, and I know I'm really smart, but I'm really still really scared. And I'm really scared to not be good enough. But what I've learned that's been incredible is probably so are the other people. Right? So are the other people. And so today, my purpose was really simple. I spent a lot of time talking about the economy, but what I want you to know is that for kids like my daughter, we have to figure out how to relate to one another in a way that lifts each other up. That it can't be the environmental movement versus the labor movement versus the women's movement versus the whoever else's movement, because I don't know about your movement, but you may be having huge gains that the environmental movement isn't right now. You may not have been experiencing a Congress that has decided if you are black, brown, woman, poor, or anything else, you should move to Canada. It is, and you might not realize that in this moment, to be a person of color when youth are being criminalized, when to be poor has been told by the federal government, when Congress stands up and says, shouldn't have food stamps, healthcare benefits, why should we pay Head Start? But shoot, we better make sure the economy recovers, but who cares about those kids who need preschool? It's like that is the debate that's happening is shocking. But what I want you to know is when you meet me, I want you to say hello. And I want you to know that if you see someone like me who doesn't respond back, it's not because they don't want to, it's because they're trying to figure out how to relate. The first time I came to a place like this and people were drumming and dancing in the streets, I was quite frankly a little shocked. And what I have to tell you is what we're still working on is feeling like we deserve that freedom, is that freedom to do that. It's like, I saw people, and what happens is, I remember even today I walked in, and I still have that instinctual reaction where I was like, what are they doing? And I'm like, okay, that's really great. They're singing and dancing in the auditorium in Marin or San Rafael. That's cool. It's cool. But then what you realize is there is an incredible luxury of being able to hold yourself and feel as though the world will respond appropriately. And what I want for my daughter, I want her to move and dance. I want her to feel like the world will respond because she deserves to dance. And that the world will open up and respect that she deserves both healthy jobs and a clean environment and so much more. And I know we can't have that if I can't acknowledge who I am. And so my prayer for my daughter and my prayer of gratitude and hope for you is that you'll remember that people like me need people like you. And if it doesn't make sense at first, it's just because we're trying to figure out how to be there. And that any movement that doesn't acknowledge the dignity of any human being is not okay. And we have a responsibility. And so, I am going to end, but I'm going to dance off the stage.